We're going to talk about a policy development that's based on national best practices as best that we can determine them to be. Now, why is this important? Well, if we just start with the baseline, we don't want our officers to go to jail. We don't want lawsuits. Litigation is going up. Different types of qualified immunity is being reduced for police officers. The landscape is completely different. So for handlers, I know we have a mix of people listening, but for handlers, it means you need to know what the rules are when you're deploying. You really need to know concisely what these objective standards are. For the organization, for the entities, it's unfair to have officers go out and do police work and not know clearly what the rules are. Okay, next slide. Okay, so let's talk a little bit. We're going to talk about policy, and then we'll talk about some issues facing Canine today, and talk a little bit about what kind of things your organization can do to try to get in line with what's the best practice. Kind of keep in mind what those definitions are. So rules, policies are rules. Okay, they're not training standards, they're not tactics, they're not administrative guidelines, they're not records keeping requirements. They're fixed rules for how you get things done. They're flexible, but they're still hard. Basically, they are the hard rule for what police work is. There should always be exceptional and exigent circumstances built into these rules. So officers should always have flexibility and also be able to understand what the exceptions will be. Should be reviewed routinely. Okay, so you have policies. There's a hybrid of policies that I've seen. Some have never been changed, and they have 1972 dates on the bottom, and they've never evolved. And others are changed every time there's a drop of a hat. Every time some sergeant has an issue in a meeting, they revise the policy and change it. And so you can't have that either. You should have a regular revision process and review process annually where the policies are looked at, addressed, and revised. And lastly, all policies need to be understood by officers and supported with timely training. To issue policies in a mailbox or send them out or to post them up on a board and then hold people accountable for them, 2 hours after they've been pinned up on a board is not fair to police officers. There's a little bit of due process we have to consider when we're doing policies. We have to involve everyone in the conversation to change policies. And when we do change policy, everyone needs to be clear on what the definitions are, what the policy means, and they need to be timely trained on it. Okay, next slide. Okay, again, for reiteration, policy shouldn't be changed every day. So you have organizations also that, the policy is changing, and you'll see the date on the top of the policy, and it literally will change every couple of days, especially during a consent decree. I've been involved in a couple of consent decrees, and as soon as some input comes in, they're going to change the policy. What's best is that organizations to have a process to clarify the current policy. Notices can clarify it. Look, if you're not aware, this is what this particular policy means. This is the defined purpose of the policy and the intent of it. Training, there should be regular training on the policy and what it means. And special orders can be used. That's what we use in LA. Special orders are used for temporary changes in policy that can be incorporated later after review. But it's a temporary change of position on a particular thing until that's incorporated into the formal policy later. Training bulletins and directives, those aren't part of policy, but they're specific to the tactical conduct that you're carrying out in the field and not specific to the rule. You always have that basic guiding rule, and then you have basically the guidelines by which you carry it out. Okay, next. Again, tactics, don't confuse tactics. You can't tell in a policy how a building can be cleared, how officers should use the dog to clear a car. You can prohibit using a dog by clearing a car on a GTA stop in a policy, but you can't tell them how to do it if you're going to allow them to do it. The actual tactics used by officers need to be facilitated through training, and then there needs to be that openness to the decision-making process of officers. Again, training, you don't put training in policy because it's timely. It can be confidential, certain things, tactical training, SWAT training. These aren't policy. That it can be policy that the team completes a certain number of hours a year, and it should be in these particular areas from this particular vendor, but it shouldn't tell you exactly what the training is. Those are separate documents. Administrative guidelines that I mentioned in my article should be separate because they're not hard organizational operational rules. If they're not operational, they shouldn't be in the department's operational policy. They should be separated out. They can be in the same book. They can be in a separate manual, which is best. Where you keep the dog, what you feed the dog, where you take the dog to be taken care of, grooming standards, hours for the unit, things like that. And conflicting policy. Your policy should not conflict with the use of force policy or others. In fact, there should be a fairly even, consistent weaving between the policies, canine policy and use of force policy. I've seen several policies that either leave open use of force and leave it vague and just don't discuss it, or the deployment and directed application of the dog as a not force option conflicts with the department's use of force policy, or arguably it conflicts. And that should never be the case, because then again, you have, in most cases, everything will be fine, but you have cases where cops are going to jail. And it's not fair to officers to not know exactly what the rules are and exactly how they apply. Next policy, next slide. So every agency has a different process for writing policy. Here is an example where you're laying out a good format for policy. And the reason I'm covering this is because I've seen this format used where it completely changes around what's in here. Basically procedures are put in where definitions should be. There's oftentimes no definitions. It doesn't cover what's actually covered. The purpose is the reason. The scope is the what's covered. Procedures are the actual guidelines for carrying out the policy. So that's the meat of it. So the policy might be, canines can be, and we'll cover canine policy in just a minute. I actually have one up here. The canine can be used for a search and to apprehend suspects. Okay, that's the general policy. Procedures are how it's carried out. Then you start with, the responsibilities of the handler, responsibilities of supervisors, and then through the review process, command, lieutenants, captains, all the way down, all the way through adjudication. And then you have some clear organizational issues that can be part of policy, which is all bites shall be documented. A supervisor shall conduct a comprehensive review of bites in a post-bite assessment and give feedback. That can all be part of it as well. Okay, next slide. Let's talk about definitions. Most policies that I've reviewed don't have any definitions. Now, why is that important? Because everyone needs to be on the same page with what a particular rule is, what a law is, what is covered by policy. Policies need to be, if I were to leave you with one thing, policies need to be objective. They cannot be subjective. If they're subjective to interpretation, you're going to start to have problems. If 4 officers can interpret one policy 4 different ways and 2 get disciplined, 1 gets fired, and the other one was well within policy, and they all did the same thing, but it's articulated in a different way, and it's based on how they subjectively understood the rule, that's not fair to the officers, not fair to the organization, and it creates liability. Clear definitions tells the everyone who's reading it objectively what exactly that particular thing is that they're talking about. What is a directed bite? A directed bite is when the handler takes the dog and says, "Pock in, Foss, get him," whatever. That's a directed bite. When you have no conversation about what a directed bite is and a bite just happens, well, he was searching, the guy got bit, fast forward, everything's okay. Wait a minute. What kind of force did you have? Did you have a contact? What is clearly What we're recommending is clearly defining what the bite is. This is force. Contact bite after a search. Dog searches, finds a bite occurs based on the decision-making by the dog is one definition of the bite. Suspect flees from the car or is located and dog's called off. Suspect gets up and flees. Officer sends dog, deploys dog directly as a use of force. Officer is the decision maker, not the dog. Two complete different things that should be talked about with grand considerations in force and policy and deployment guidelines, and should be consistently defined within the policy. Again, exceptions and certain exigencies. Everyone should know what that is. You can't start talking about, well, the search situation was exigent at the time. You need to be able to kind of define what that is. We'll talk about hard out, but it's just saying physical removal of the dog versus a call off of the dog from afar. Serious crime, real quick. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but serious crime. This needs to be talked about. So I think most of the policies that we've seen have something to the effect of dogs can be deployed when there is a serious crime. A search can be conducted when the suspect is believed to have committed a serious crime. Okay, what is a serious crime? How many states are y'all from? So we have a certain number of people here and a certain number of people listening from all across the country. What's a serious crime where you're from? What's a serious crime in your county, in your city, in your state? Completely different definitions. They're probably fairly consistent, but they're not exactly the same. So what do we mean by serious crime when we put that in a policy? And I've seen most policies have serious crime when the suspect's wanted for a serious crime. And what it is this is trying to put the definition under Graham within the policy, but in reality, you're confusing the canine handler. When you have serious crime, the handler now subjectively must determine what the serious crime is. He has to listen to the facts in his briefing before he deploys, and then he's going to deploy based on whether he believes there's a serious crime. So it's best to tell them what a serious crime is. How many of your agencies deploy a dog on a directed bite or a search for a GTA only, property crime only? Probably quite a few. And a lot of you probably leave it up to either the supervisor or their handler on scene to determine whether you should deploy the dog on the GTA, what the facts of the GTA were. That should not be the case. If it's a property crime GTA, you need to know whether to deploy the dog or not. I'm not saying one way or the other what you're going to do, but everyone needs to be clear on what a serious crime is, when a dog can be deployed. And the point is, these are why definitions are important in policy. Next slide. Okay, where do you start? Best practices is essentially what you're going for. There's no reason why your agency, doesn't matter how big or how small, cannot be the absolute best and the professional model for canine policing in your region or in your state. And that's done through policy and training. Okay, determine what's a best practice policy for your organization. It's consistent with community expectations, with your organizational leadership's expectations, the government entity, the county, the city's expectations, and a best practice according to the highest level of the state of training in canine across the country. Now we'll talk about it a little bit more. I talk more in my article, but that doesn't mean going to every seminar and bringing back every maybe, never heard of canine procedure and bringing it back to your organization. It means consistent application of best practices that are practiced across the country. And here's a definition for best practice in police canine. You can read that. It's on my website too. You can use it if you want. So let's talk about where to go when we're talking about changing policy or looking at assessing policy. Next slide. Okay, these are just a kind of an overview of things that you can keep in mind. You can have a copy of this PowerPoint too, so you can follow it if you want to. It's certainly nothing's mandatory, nothing's required, and there's nothing mandated by law in here or anything else. But it's just some things that might help you as you're moving along, trying to keep your folks out of trouble. So You should start with a plan. If this can be one cop, I know small departments. I've worked for several small departments. Small departments will assign one person to do that. We'll assume one officer to handle everything. To develop a plan to look at the policy or the policies. And if you're looking at canine policy, you should look at use of force policy and any others that are covered by force or that are similar. Conduct an assessment, an honest assessment. If anyone in the room says everything's fine, don't worry about it, we don't need to change anything, you need to take another look, because that is a common mantra for police: is we're fine. If a lawsuit or a federal court doesn't order us to change, we're not going to change. We've been fine for years. We're just going to keep doing what we're doing. Identify areas where you should change. Some things you should think about. Do some research. Take a look at what's best in a particular area. Develop and revise policies. Get feedback from officers and for personnel. Get input from personnel. And then when you develop and sign those policies, you should have clear written guidelines, and then they should be reviewed and make sure that they're clear and objective. And a good way to do it is you throw a policy into a room and you see how many different people can come up with a different outcome for the same policy. And you do that until there's only one outcome for that policy. And then it becomes objective. That's when there's one objective standard to apply. And then when you do it, you train to that standard, you follow up, and you retrain as needed. Okay, next. This is an example of an effective canine policy. Okay, here you're prioritizing search with a secondary focus on apprehension. It doesn't put one over the other, but it prioritizes what your dogs are used for. Again, this is just a sample policy. You can kind of consider this or don't, but it just explains how the policy a policy consideration works here. So the canine is used. The purpose and scope is basically, this policy is to govern police canine. That's the purpose and scope. Policy is to track and locate missing persons and contraband, and consistent with this policy, and you can even put it in with all policies or with the use of force policy, to search for and apprehend criminal suspects. Okay, that's the policy for the organization here. The policy is we use the dog as a priority to search, which is really what you do anyway. And then secondarily, a secondary consideration is the dog used as an apprehension mode. In litigation, in a deposition, in court, it sounds good to say this dog is used to find people. This is what we use them for. Well, don't you use them to bite? Isn't it, use of force? Well, yes, but the primary purpose of our dogs is to assist personnel and in conducting searches. And then, yes, the dog can be used for apprehension, either in contact mode or in apprehension mode, directed apprehension mode, whatever is necessary at the time. So you can kind of see how policy can really change an organizational dynamic, the appearance of it when you go to court, what it actually means when they put it on a whiteboard and you have to explain it. It's not, when you have policies that say canine can be used to apprehend or to search, period, that's not a policy that's really best practices anymore. We need to be a little bit more focused on what we're using our tools for. Every aspect of police work is basically the same. We're having to hone down a little bit more, be a little bit more consistent with what we're doing with objective standards. And this is an example of it. Feel free to contact me on my website, policing-solutions.com, and there's videos and stuff there and conversations, or engage in any conversation you have. Thank you.